When you think of Wall Street, what likely flashes through your mind are sharp suits, skyscrapers glinting in the sunlight, and the ceaseless heartbeat of American finance. But beneath the surface glamour lies a web of history, rivalry, and vaults overflowing with fortunes. The Wall Street district in Lower Manhattan isn't just a mecca for numbers and stocks. It's the intersection of old money grandeur, ambitious newcomers, and those shadowy figures for whom boundaries exist only to be tested. Since the roaring 1940s, this financial hub has morphed from cobblestones and horse-drawn carriages into the modern-day Babylon of banking. Hidden behind nondescript marble facades, families of legendary diamond merchants, discreet Swiss consultants, and blue-blooded jewelry dynasties have operated their business for generations. Their fortunes were not merely built on market speculation but on tangible treasures: gold bars, rare watches, uncut diamonds, vintage coins, and heirlooms with histories shadowed by world wars and Wall Street crashes. Nestled among iconic streets with names like Pearl, Pine, and Liberty sits Safeguard Vaults Inc. Unlike most anonymously named establishments, Safeguard built its reputation on absolute discretion and near-mythical tales of impenetrable security. Locals have said, if you want to make sure your grandkids stay rich, you leave your fortune in Safeguard. Their underground vaults, installed deep below the ever-buzzing sidewalk, are surrounded by steel-lined tunnels, radiation-baffling concrete, and security doors custom-forged by artisans who never left their names. Every year, more than 200 jewelry retailers and precious stone traders discreetly shuttled between their showrooms and Safeguard's guarded elevators. These are not ordinary customers. They arrive in armored SUVs accompanied by bodyguards, sometimes even under the watchful eye of off-duty NYPD detectives moonlighting for extra cash. Each safety deposit box ranges in size from a shoebox to a steamer trunk, but all share a singular trait: contents that write the fortunes of entire families or even corporations. The rental rates are stratospheric, but no one ever complained. Any problem money can't solve, well, that's what Safeguard was supposed to prevent. The building's ground floor might appear mundane to the casual pedestrian, just another mid-century relic sandwiched between coffee shops and investment firms. Yet, beneath layers of concrete and an almost paranoid collection of alarm systems lies a treasure trove insulated from both mobsters and market meltdowns. The walls are so thick, legend has it, that not even the raucous parades of New Year's Eve can disturb the diamond-laden silence below. Wall Street is a paradox. Old-school etiquette overlaps with ruthless ambition, and backroom deals are cloaked by decades-old trust. For 7 decades, these vaults were untouched, a sanctuary of American legacy and off-the-record histories. And it was in precisely this gilded world, equal parts tradition and temptation, that the strangest and most audacious heist in New York's recent memory was born. Let me take you right to the heart of what makes this heist so unusual. The masterminds behind it weren't the brash, reckless young daredevils you'd expect from a Hollywood blockbuster. Instead, the criminal architects of this scheme were the very embodiment of experience, caution, and a lifetime spent walking the razor's edge between law and lawlessness. Picture it, men in their late 60s, 70s, and even one or two pushing 80, all hands weathered by decades of mischief, all minds sharpened by surviving every twist and turn of the American underworld. Their lives had seen everything from the frantic days of post-war New York to the digital era, yet they'd never truly left the shadows. Their so-called leader was Michael Big Mike Rogers, a towering figure of 78 with a reputation that stretched from East Harlem down to Midtown. Big Mike was infamous not for flamboyance but for almost military precision. He'd once pulled off a string of audacious armored car robberies in the 1970s, only to spend 15 years trading stories and hard-won wisdom behind federal bars. Mike had the charisma to unite men who'd otherwise be rivals, a cool head under pressure and an absolute refusal to use violence if a smarter workaround existed. His right-hand man, Tony "the Hawk" Rivera, aged 69, was the mechanical wizard. Tony's eyesight wasn't what it used to be, but his fingers had lost none of their magic. Back in the day, he could pick locks by feel alone, and he'd once spent 6 months tunneling into a New Jersey bank vault without tripping a single alarm. More recently, he'd turned his skills to bypassing the biometric scanners that were supposed to make modern vaults impenetrable. Then there was Clifford Tunnel Rat Johnson, 73 years old, a legend among those who chart the city's forgotten passageways. Clifford could read the blueprints of old buildings like short stories, spotting every weak point, forgotten air vent and maintenance shaft. He grew up in Brooklyn's rumbling subway shadows, and he never lost his love for creeping unseen beneath the city's skin. The crew was rounded out by Lewis Carter, 65, the tech brain of the operation. Lewis had made his bones as a security consultant in the 90s, his specialty being finding the one flaw experts always said didn't exist. He was the reason the rest of the crew believed this job could even be possible in a world of thermal sensors and algorithmic security. Louis' toolkit was a mix of old-fashioned jammers and tricked-out laptops, and he handled each with the pride of an artist. What united these men was the quiet, stubborn fire that comes with years spent defying boundaries. They had nothing left to prove to the world, yet each felt the gnawing need to pull off one final job. Some needed the money, true, but more than that, they craved the electric rush of proving that age was just a number, and that cunning counted for more than muscle. They'd watched the world change around them, cryptocurrency, facial recognition, drones, but at heart, they remained old school, respectful of the craft, painting their masterpiece in the city's deepest shadows. Rumor had it that long before the plan started taking shape in any real sense, the men had crossed paths in courtrooms and correctional facilities, sometimes as rivals, sometimes as reluctant teammates. By the time they reunited in a Brooklyn bar, with their hair gray or gone and their backs a little bent, they knew each other's strengths, weaknesses, superstitions, and regrets better than anyone else on earth. The city might have moved on, but as they sat hunched over scotch and bourbon, it was clear that their story wasn't over yet. It was about to reach its most daring chapter. There's a saying on Wall Street: if you can name it, someone here has found a way to store it, insure it, or turn it into money. Nowhere does this adage ring truer than in the hallowed halls of Safeguard Vaults Inc., the underground stronghold trusted for decades by America's wealthiest families, celebrity jewelers, and glittering international dealers. To the untrained eye, Safeguard's business might have been just another cog in the roaring machinery of Lower Manhattan. But for those in the know, crossing its threshold was like stepping through Alice's looking glass. Clients came from across the globe, descending into a world where discretion, security, and the sheer weight of fortune were everyday currency. The building itself projected minimalism at the street level, but beneath the city's grumbling subway lines and ancient utility tunnels sprawled a daunting labyrinth of steel and concrete, perennially immune to both time and tides. Safeguard vaults operated as the beating heart for more than 200 jewelry boutiques, reputable diamond traders, and boutique Swiss wealth managers. Many carried family crests on their business cards, and some deposited heirlooms not just for their monetary value, but for the legends attached. Crowns worn at European galas, war medals awarded for valor, watches that had circled the globe with world leaders. At any hour, you might catch a discreet entourage, bodyguards in Burberry, twins carrying velvet cases, slipping out of a bulletproof Cadillac, hustling their prizes in under the cover of anonymity. What truly set Safeguard apart was the mixture of old-world rituals and cutting-edge technology. Each safe deposit box, whether the size of a passport or a steamer trunk, required a precisely orchestrated dual authentication, biometric scans for the new era, vintage keyways for those who only trusted the old ways. Guards, often ex-military, roamed the marble corridors, programmed not just for vigilance but for absolute discretion. Patrons rarely exchanged more than a nod of greeting, and names were as closely guarded as the treasures themselves. Monthly rental for these vaults was astronomical, some spots even rumored to require a waiting list and a recommendation letter from existing members. But in a place where fortunes could be won or lost overnight, and where some clients literally weighed their assets before champagne brunches, prudence was priceless. After all, Safeguard's best-selling promise was this: not only could your treasures be preserved for generations, but they would sleep undisturbed beneath the chaos of city life, immune to market panics, criminal ambitions, and even natural disaster. Legends grew around Safeguard vaults. A diamond merchant once told me he'd sooner leave his fortune here than in a national bank or even his own penthouse. Rumors persisted of mysterious foreign visitors renting entire aisles for months, trucks delivering cases with diplomatic escorts, or anonymous billionaires who kept only a single locked box with a childhood photo, a love letter, and a gold coin untouched for 40 years. If Wall Street was the empire of risk and reward, then Safeguard Vaults was the cathedral where dreams, grand or modest, legitimate or secret, were guarded, realized, and sometimes, just sometimes, lost forever. In this place, every fantasy of wealth had a physical, tangible home. It was an edifice not just of metal and concrete, but of trust, myth, and generations of ambition, all waiting unknowingly for the day the unthinkable might finally happen. It all began on a rainy Thursday night in late February, the kind New Yorkers say seeps under your coat and chills you to the bone. The borough of Brooklyn was a patchwork of neon reflected on wet sidewalks, and tucked between a shuttered bakery and a pawn shop stood the faded sign of McCafferty's, a neighborhood bar as old as the subway lines rumbling beneath it. There was nothing extraordinary about McCafferty's to the outside world, a place where stock traders and construction workers nursed their drinks in stoic silence, the jukebox perpetually stuck on old Sinatra, a bartender who knew when to listen, and perhaps more importantly, when not to. On that night, though, McCafferty's became the crucible of a plan that would rewrite the city's criminal legend. The four men gathered at the shadowed end booth hardly stood out. In fact, they'd made an art of blending in. A faded Yankees cap pulled low, a scuffed overcoat, a cough here, a stale joke there. Yet beneath the banter about midwinter colds and aching backs, tension simmered. They ordered whiskey neat, their fingers tapping out silent codes on the sticky wood table. To anyone watching, they were just old friends catching up, maybe even discussing grandkids or heart medication, but each one felt a secret pulse, like the conductor's signal before the orchestra storms into life. Big Mike, the de facto leader, always arrived a few minutes early, scouting corners with a veteran's eyes. He'd select the booth with the least sightlines from the street, always instructing the bartender to keep refills sparse. Tony, the hawk, would enter next, eyes scanning for unfamiliar faces, patting his pocket for the reassuring lump of his lockpick set. Clifford, silent and meticulous, brought a battered manila envelope filled with hand-sketched blueprints and city grid maps dating back decades. The last to arrive was Lewis the Thinker, whose outward calm belied the storm of calculations going on behind his wire-rimmed glasses. Each man had his reasons for being there, resentment at being written off by a city obsessed with youth, the financial squeeze of medical bills, the devilish spark of one last hurrah. They had lived long enough to see their names fade from the headlines, their exploits lumped in with the cautionary tales. Retirement for them was a sentence, not a respite. But tonight, in the sheltering hum of McCafferty's, hope found a footing. They spoke in code, referencing old movies and long-closed racetracks, rehearsing scenarios where impossible odds were toppled with guile alone. One by one, Clifford slid the blueprints across, his finger pausing on utility chutes and forgotten side entrances. Tony described recent security technology, all designed by people who think only in straight lines, you know? And Lewis muttered about false signals and digital ghosts. What set this council of elders apart wasn't desperation, but a giddy, dangerous optimism. They weren't planning vengeance against a world that had moved on, they were planning a masterpiece. Sometimes the greatest dreams don't begin in corporate towers or lavish clubs. They germinate in the smoky back booth of an unremarkable bar, in the hearts of those who've lost much, but still hunger for a legacy that won't be forgotten. If every legendary heist needs an elite team, then what came next was inevitable. The four original masterminds, toughened by age but not time, knew even the cleverest plan could collapse unless the right hands, and minds, were put to work. Over mugs of coffee and nights spent hunched over faded blueprints, they set about assembling their dream team. Frank Williams was the first new recruit. Clifford's nephew, Frank was younger at 62 but already sported a lifetime's worth of scars and an encyclopedic knowledge of security cameras. His obsession bordered on the fanatical. Rumor had it, he'd spent a summer mapping out every blind spot in Midtown just for fun. He'd installed countless CCTV systems in New York's ritziest apartments and sabotaged just as many for clients on both sides of the law. For Frank, this heist was less about cash and more about finally proving he was every bit as good as the old legends. Next came Hector Lockjaw White, the kind of guy who could crack open a safe with nothing but a paperclip and a roll of duct tape. At 56, Hector was the baby of the crew, but what he lacked in gray hair he made up for in sheer bravado and an uncanny sense for mechanical puzzles. Notoriously tight-lipped, he let his work speak for itself. He was brought on after Big Mike personally tested him with an old Soviet vault lock. It took Hector less than 3 minutes, blindfolded. Sam Carton's role was pure theater. A master of disguise pushing 70, Sam could pass as an absent-minded tourist, a Wall Street analyst, or a building inspector with identical credibility. He'd once faked an entire persona for nearly a year to infiltrate a rival crew's warehouse, and his ability to glean information while never attracting suspicion was unmatched. Sam's job was to scout safeguard vaults, blending in, taking mental notes of guard routines, figuring out which access cards were used on which floors. Finally, there was Rick Grimes, the wheelman. At 60, Rick was a legend in the circles where armored truck drivers and getaway drivers exchanged war stories. He was known for his icy nerves, lightning reflexes, and the fact that he'd never once been caught in traffic on a job. Rick had briefly retired to Florida, but the call of one last ride proved too good to refuse. He joined on the understanding that if the job went south, he'd be the last man out. If anyone could outmaneuver a midtown police chase, it was Rick. The new octet, calling themselves the Final Job Squad, wasn't just a gang. They were a patchwork of unique skills, generational experience, and mutual respect, each member aware that the margin for error was thinner than ever. Night after night, their planning sessions grew longer, their maps more intricate. Every member was assigned a role: surveillance, tech, muscle, logistics, no detail too small, no variable unconsidered. Trust formed through decades of shared risk cemented their bond, yet beneath the surface each man harbored his doubts, secrets, and old rivalries, making their alliance as volatile as it was effective. But the prize was irresistible, and for the first time in years, they all felt the electric shimmer of destiny at their fingertips. Unexpected fortune often favors those who know how to wait. For months, the crew had monitored every tiny shift in Safeguard Vault's routines, but no amount of planning could have predicted the chaos of early April 2016. That morning, Lower Manhattan awoke not to the bustle of bankers and traders, but to a deafening silence. A catastrophic electrical failure had plunged the neighborhood into darkness and confusion. It started in the pre-dawn hours, a surge in an underground transformer, followed by a domino effect that sent block after block spiraling into blackout. Traffic lights flickered and died. Security shutters ground to a halt midway. In high-rises, emergency generators sputtered uncertainly, unable to meet the surging demand. Telecom networks blinked off. Even the stock exchange, the pulsing heart of Wall Street, found its screens frozen, its traders pacing hallways with useless phones in hand. Safeguard Vaults, a citadel designed to weather almost any storm, was not immune. Its redundant systems buzzed to life, but problems multiplied in the tangled web of cables and switchboards beneath the city. Scanners and cameras defaulted to fail-safe modes, their signals caught in digital limbo. The company, always quick to tighten procedures at the first whiff of risk, made the rare call to close early, sending home security personnel and freezing client access until power could be restored. The disruption rippled outward. Banks, insurance offices, boutique investment houses all shut their doors in cautious unison. Delivery trucks rerouted, armored vans waited idle, police patrols, stretched thin by gridlock and minor incidents, rolled by with sirens cut. Regular Wall Street inhabitants grumbled about the inconvenience, never guessing that somewhere nearby, a handful of men watched with the inimitable patience of seasoned predators. For the crew, information came from police scanners, cryptic radio chatter, and hasty news reports. But as they sat in dimly lit apartments, sipping cheap coffee and listening to silence pulse through the city, the truth became clear. The iron shield of Safeguard Vaults was at its most vulnerable. Without full monitoring, with staff scattered and with communications unreliable, their window had opened, brief, almost miraculous and perilous in its uncertainty. Decisions were made with tacit glances and quick nods. This was not the meticulously orchestrated D-Day they'd expected, but the city itself had handed them a once-in-a-lifetime invitation. The men set their plans in motion almost wordlessly, each feeling the electric charge of fate in the air. None of them would say it aloud. Superstition had no place in their line of work, but each knew the story of every great heist included a moment when luck tipped the scales. Across Lower Manhattan, while most saw only inconvenience and confusion, an elite few recognized the chaos for what it truly was: possibility. The plan was ready, the city unwittingly complicit. All that remained was to move unseen into the void left by one wild twist of fate. The city of New York, as midnight approached, was a living organism. Its lights normally flickered endlessly, its noises a constant backdrop to every secret and scheme. But on this extraordinary night, the normally unyielding rhythm of "the city that never sleeps" had faltered, and that rare stillness became the cloak that the Final Job Squad would use to their advantage. Lower Manhattan, swathed in darkness from the blackout, felt both exposed and safer than ever to anyone bold enough to seize the chance. While most residents sheltered in candlelit apartments or lingered in bars turned sanctuary from the storm, 4 men in maintenance uniforms emerged quietly from the rosy haze of street lamps and drifting April fog. They moved like seasoned stagehands who knew every backstage corridor, every angle hidden from the audience. Their carefully choreographed approach was the result of endless rehearsals. shoe soles padded to silence, radios set to an agreed static hum, each man spaced precisely to avoid drawing attention from any stray passerby or loitering security guard. Every movement was designed to appear unremarkable, a group of late-night city workers muddling through the blackout one more time. As midnight settled over New York, the city's usual pulse was nowhere to be found. What had once been a neon glow was now a patchwork of darkness, spliced only by the occasional flicker of backup generators. The silence felt supernatural. A world paused, every secret and sin holding its breath. For almost anyone, the blackout would have been a source of frustration or fear, a reminder of how even the world's greatest metropolis could be humbled. But for the final job squad, those shadows became a sanctuary, a brief window when the impossible suddenly hovered within reach. Hidden within the drizzling fog, 4 men moved with uncanny synchronization. If there was anxiety, it was sealed beneath layers of discipline honed by decades skulking on the edge of the law. They wore municipal blue steel-toed boots muffled with surgical tape and carried battered tool cases marked with stickers from real city contractors. Rick, their wheelman, remained in a darkened alley, car idling in near silence with a police scanner humming softly, a sentinel in the wilderness of power loss. The squad advanced on Safeguard Vault's side entrance, normally lurking beneath blinding spotlights and under the gaze of vigilant guards. Tonight all was different. Frank moved first, crouching at the access panel, torch beam hooded beneath his fingers. He scanned the shadowed alcove, finding the external security camera frozen, the usual green LED dead. For weeks they'd mapped every guard's path, every late-night cleaning schedule. Now, with much of the staff sent home early and systems sputtering along on auxiliary power, the intricate ballet of their plan suddenly felt organic, almost effortless. Hector and Tony, posing as electrical workers, worked a practiced script. At the service entrance, Hector spun a plausible tale about a transformer meltdown to the one sleepy guard who stuck to his post despite orders to leave. The guard, visibly stressed, hardly looked twice at their paperwork, a forgery good enough that even management would hesitate before questioning. Once inside, their steps slowed, careful to keep close to the emergency lights painting long, thin shadows across the corridor floors. Navigating to the vault required a blend of memory, intuition, and luck. Clifford, the passageway expert, led, whispering reminders about weak spots in the architecture, a vent that could be used for eavesdropping, a loading dock that echoed with the footsteps of off-duty rent-a-cops. They moved as a living chain, one man scouting, one covering, one monitoring radio chatter, one always thinking ahead to the exit. Each hallway was treated as a possible trap, each corner a potential ambush. Inside, the temperature dropped sharply, a combination of subterranean chill and the adrenaline flooding their veins. The squad stuck mostly to maintenance shafts, out-of-use stairwells and mop closets, ducking low and timing each movement with the absolute paranoia that befits experience. They'd rehearsed their route with blueprints and model sets for weeks, but the real tension came from knowing that no plan survives first contact with reality. Outside, the city was beginning to stir, with pockets of residents venturing onto balconies, lighting candles, wondering when their world would return. Within the tomb-quiet underbelly of Safeguard, the squad's breaths clouded in the frigid air, broken only by the occasional muttered curse, the soft scrape of a tool against concrete, or the one nervous laugh that proved, despite everything, they were still alive and for this night, truly in control of their own fate. In the depths beneath Manhattan, surrounded by silence and the distant hum of backup generators, the crew finally stood face to face with Safeguard Vault's legendary fortified entrance, a door forged by craftsmen whose names were as secretive as their work. The steel, several inches thick, was said to be resistant to diamond-tipped drills, thermite charges, even explosives, so much so that rumors claimed not even the feds could force it without days of preparation. It wasn't just the physical challenge, this door represented the ultimate separator between a lifetime of ambition and their wildest dreams. Big Mike took charge, his seasoned eyes tracing the weld lines and searching for micro-fractures, an instinct honed by decades of criminal apprenticeship. He gestured silently, and Tony went to work. Tony, now a legend in his own right, unpacked a custom toolkit, a symphony of slim jigs, electric pick guns, and devices designed to measure vibration sensors embedded inside the locking mechanism. Every movement was soundless, rehearsed to perfection, a dance built on trust of both man and machine. With Louis providing low, clipped instructions in the glow of a handheld monitor, the team carefully scanned for thermal detectors and pressure plates, any modern defense that might have been retrofitted after their blueprints were drawn. Clifford crouched at the ventilation shaft, one eye fixed on the corridor and one hand on a tiny walkie-talkie, alert for even the faintest sound of approaching trouble. The real contest began when Tony slipped a micro camera deep into the lock's narrow mouth. The screen sparked to life. Dozens of tumblers, each set to a unique depth and tension protected by a rolling code digital override. Louis had once boasted that computers would never truly make a safe smarter, only more time-consuming. Now his theory was put to the test, as he patched a cable into a nearby wall panel and began feeding the lock false signals, playing digital hide-and-seek with the alarm server above. For 20 minutes the crew held their breath. Tony's fingers danced and paused, sweat beading down his brow as he manipulated picks the width of a sewing needle and cyber jigs meant to scramble the biometric readout. At last, the locking bolts gave a slow, almost reluctant click, one that sounded louder in their headphones than a thunder crack in the empty halls. But it wasn't over. Beyond the first door was a secondary barrier, a time delay lock, armored glass, and a ring of steel-shielded pins. Here, patience was their greatest weapon. They waited out the timer, synced watches, didn't dare whisper. The sense of anticipation was stifling, a tension unlike any other moment in the heist. With each tick of the delay, the air grew heavier, the stakes more tangible. Finally, the second lock disengaged. The great steel door eased open with a groan no one could mistake. Centuries of ambition, greed, and secrecy echoed in that one sound. They had crossed the Rubicon. Ingenuity had bested engineering, and the final job squad now teetered at the edge of unprecedented fortune, or ruin. In the depths of safeguard vaults with the steel doors already conquered, the real test of the old-timers' ingenuity was just beginning. A colossal safe, braced against the back wall like a metallic beast, awaited them. It was rumored to be the latest in reinforced engineering, a hybrid of old-world craftsmanship and state-of-the-art tech defenses. Most would have balked at the sight of it. Layers of concrete shielding, a labyrinth of hardened rebar, vibration sensors, acoustic alarms, and enough steel to stop a wrecking ball. But for these seasoned veterans, it was the pinnacle of a lifetime's obsession, a puzzle that both taunted and thrilled. Clifford, whose childhood had been spent crawling through the bones of abandoned New York buildings, moved with reverence. He placed his ear against the cool, impervious wall and tapped, listening for subtle differences in echo, mapping out the internal skeleton of the beast. Frank, ever the perfectionist, used a custom-built thermal camera to identify cool spots, potential weak points where the metal might be thinnest. Meanwhile, Tony's gloved fingers danced across blueprints and diagrams, a lifetime's worth of criminal evolution culminating in this one surgical strike. Breaking into this safe by simply spinning dials was never the plan. The combination, if it even existed in a form they could access, would be impossible to guess, especially with time ticking. Instead, their assault required power tools worthy of a construction site: diamond-tipped industrial drills, electromagnetic harnesses, silenced rotary hammers, and a newly procured hydraulic spreader capable of prying open steel like a can of sardines. The equipment was hoisted down the access tunnels piece by piece over previous nights, each part camouflaged to look like maintenance supplies should anyone stumble upon them. Even the dust extraction system, designed to whisk away any telltale signs of drilling, was crafted from scavenged vacuum parts and garden hose, a signature Louis flourish. As the onslaught began, the air filled with a muted, cyclical hum. Drilling through concrete was unforgiving, the bits skating and shuddering against hidden mesh. Clifford's hands, steady despite the years, marked each cut, reminding the team that a single mistake could set off the vibration sensors, rendering the entire mission for nothing. Every few inches they swapped tools and roles. Frank controlled the borescope camera, feeding real-time images of rebar placement to a laptop. Tony managed the drill, pausing at predetermined intervals to listen for that deadly click of a sensor engaging. Big Mike, their anchor, counted out the minutes, always aware that the longer they stayed, the greater the risk of outside detection. After feverish hours, sweat slicked their brows and panic flirted at the edges of their resolve. A breakthrough, literally, came. The drill finally breached the last millimeter of resistance, revealing the shimmering interior wall of the safe. Cheers were stifled in favor of grim concentration. The next phase required the hydraulic spreader, deployed with a surgeon's touch to widen the breach. The metallic groans echoed like ancient cries, but the room's soundproofing and blackout-shrouded city ensured their work went unnoticed. Inside the safe, treasures glimmered: jewelry, stacks of rare coins, velvet pouches of diamonds, and watches that had kept time for dynasties. Each item had to be handled with care. Frank documented everything for their meticulous plan to offload assets, while Tony and Clifford carefully extracted bundles into duffel bags lined against static to avoid tripping any last-line alarms. It wasn't simply brute force that won the day, nor pure luck. It was the synthesis of old and new skills, artful planning, technological adaptation, and the quiet camaraderie that comes from decades of shared risk. For a moment, time seemed to hesitate, as if recognizing the rare artistry of the unfolding caper. Then, on cue, the team wheeled their laden bags through the breached wall, their battle with the vault ending just as dawn's first rays crept across Manhattan's battered skyline. The first shrill echo of the alarm felt like a punch to the gut, unexpected, electrifying, and enough to test the nerves of even the most seasoned criminal. Inside the concrete bowels of safeguard vaults, the silence they had so carefully cultivated shattered instantly. For a split second, the final job squad froze, years of instinct fighting the paralyzing grip of adrenaline. The old men shot glances at each other that carried only two words: move now. The choreography that followed was nothing less than breathtaking. Each man had rehearsed his role to razor precision, but in this moment improvisation became king. Clifford, closest to the vault entrance, snapped shut his pack and began erasing boot prints with a roll of tape wrapped around his palm, while Rick signaled to check their digital disruptors, making sure the cellular jammers held and advisory signals didn't escape beyond those stone walls. Big Mike's face was stone. He barked silent orders using only his eyes, orchestrating the hasty exit. The team retraced their steps, not the most obvious path, but a network of side tunnels and crawl spaces Clifford had mapped out through weeks of late-night reconnaissance. Every inch of progress was a battle against panic. The distant pounding of boots, the wail of approaching sirens somewhere above, and the growing fear that any second a flashlight beam would slice through the dark made their breathing shallow and hearts pound. The duffel bags, now heavy with fortune, seemed suddenly to weigh a ton. As they navigated toward their previously scouted escape hatch, Frank paused just long enough to deploy a final layer of misdirection, a timed smoke canister and a shorted fuse wired to trigger a false fire alarm in one of the service corridors. This diversion drew building security and, crucially, both real and private police units to the wrong stretch of hallway. The narrow timing was crucial. Seconds separated success from disaster. On the street level, Hector, playing lookout, messaged a single code word to Rick's burner phone from an alley. Clear, it was their signal that the surveillance van hadn't yet shown up, and the neighboring office cameras had been blanked by a surge timed with the original blackout chaos. With practiced calm, the men stashed their tools in the hollowed-out toolbox Frank had stowed on a sanitation truck nearby, then slipped, almost invisible, through the same maintenance tunnel they'd used to enter. Emerging back into the fog-cloaked city, their uniforms marked them as nothing more than exhausted night shift workers finally heading home after a shift from hell. Not a word was spoken until the last of their number, quietly blending in with the early morning crowd of delivery drivers and janitors, ducked into the borrowed SUV parked several blocks away. Each man felt the bruising crash of relief and terror, so close to glory, yet one wrong step from ruin. As dawn stretched over Manhattan, New Yorkers buzzed about power outages and gridlock, entirely unaware of the heist that had just redefined the city's underworld history. Meanwhile, tucked away in their unremarkable apartments, the final job squad breathed easier, knowing that in the razor-thin space between catastrophe and triumph, they had found both their freedom and, at least for now, their legend. The full weight of New York City law enforcement crashed down with a ferocity unseen in years, as soon as reports began to circulate about the Safeguard Vault's break-in. The shockwaves rippled through every level of the NYPD and federal investigative branches. A high-profile, utterly audacious heist had materialized beneath their noses, in the very heart of the city's financial district. Nothing like this had been pulled off so spectacularly, in scope, in thoroughness, or in sheer bravado, since the infamous cases that inspired Hollywood scripts decades ago, and the embarrassment pushed every detective and forensic lead into overdrive. At first the authorities were stumped. The heist had destabilized every assumption. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, and video surveillance returned little more than blurry silhouettes moving with clockwork calm through pitch-darkened corridors. The timing coincided too neatly with the blackout, giving investigators the haunting suspicion that whoever planned this job had either engineered the chaos or, equally chilling, had the presence of mind to seize the moment instantly when opportunity struck. Every available officer spent hours trawling through electrical service logs, hoping to find patterns or tampered circuits, anything that might point to an inside man or a technical accomplice, but nothing concrete emerged. Frustration mounted as Safeguard's shattered vault became a crime scene teeming with experts and tension. Crime scene techs dusted every surface, forensically vacuuming fibers, hair, and even attempting to reconstruct movement based on the few scattered boot prints that weren't immediately wiped. Interviews with current and former employees went nowhere. The labor pool was huge and turnover high, yet none of the maintenance crews seemed even remotely suspicious after extensive background checks. The city hummed with rumors, especially in the jewelry and finance world, but everyone close to the case remained tight-lipped, both out of fear and respect for Safeguard's bulletproof reputation. In the thick of this high-pressure investigation, it was a seemingly minor detail, the sort detectives nearly overlook, that cracked open the wall of silence. Reviewing license plate camera footage from blocks around Safeguard in the hours bridging the blackout, an analyst spotted a silver SUV making repeated, oddly circuitous passes through several intersections near the vault. Digging into the DMV records and mapping the vehicle's activity created a web that didn't immediately scream criminal. But with no normal explanation for its unwavering route under such bizarre circumstances, red flags shot up fast. The discovery galvanized the manhunt with new energy. Surveillance teams were dispatched with strict instructions: follow the paper trail, watch for any hasty asset sales, and scrutinize any suspicious purchases that would contribute to an operation of this sophistication. Soon another breadcrumb emerged. An obscure purchase record from a Brooklyn hardware store where, just days before the heist, two men matching rough descriptions from the blurry camera footage had bought a hydraulic spreader. Such a tool, rare for any legitimate repair work but essential for breaching serious vaults, set off immediate alarm bells. The store's receipt, paired with surveillance video showing a distinctive limp and mannerism resembling that of Michael Big Mike Rogers from previous police archives, drew the circle tighter. Still, the suspects remained ghosts. They'd covered their tracks with the kind of studied discipline acquired only over many decades of criminal experience, and for several tense weeks after the robbery, it looked as if they might disappear into the urban sprawl, the stuff of legend and cautionary tale. But the city does not let go easily. The Joint Task Force, made up of NYPD's elite detectives, federal agents, and even cyber specialists, played a relentless game of patience and attrition. They mapped connections between the suspects, trawling through years of phone records, financial statements, and, crucially, watching for any deviations in daily routines among known associates of the old-school criminal underground. Anonymity, it turned out, was harder to maintain in the age of interconnected street cameras, ATM withdrawals, public transit scanners, and after-the-fact facial recognition deployed on old surveillance tapes. The first break came when a piece of the loot, a rare watch engraved with initials long whispered about among Manhattan's jewelry elite, surfaced at a pawn shop in Queens, flagged by a sharp-eyed investigator, tracking serial numbers distributed to every dealer in the city. The watch, traced back to a shopkeeper who claimed it came from a guy whose face didn't match his birth certificate, opened a new angle to the investigation. Under pressure, contact after contact unraveled. Handlers and fences, eager to avoid major prison time, began feeding authorities trickles of information about nervous, unusually large transactions straddling the boroughs. Each thread the task force pulled seemed impossibly fragile, until, after weeks marked by stakeouts, late-night raids, and tense interviews in crumbling city apartments, the dominoes began to fall. The aged members of the final job squad were picked up one by one, some hiding in plain sight, clinging to their lifelong routines, others attempting last-ditch plans to flee or launder their share of the loot. Michael Big Mike himself was found in a rent-controlled apartment scarcely changed since the 1970s, reading the newspaper as if awaiting his fate. In the end, it wasn't a dramatic chase or cinematic shootout that brought the men down, but a relentless, methodical pursuit and the tiniest overlooked clues: a license plate camera, an odd purchase, a watch that never should have left the vault. The myth they'd almost pulled off one last score, perfectly clean, was unraveled by the dogged ingenuity of investigators, turning what could have been the heist of a century into a bittersweet epilogue of missed chances and unexpected betrayals. Although the final job squad's remarkable heist reverberated with a sense of legend, its conclusion was far from triumphant. Each member of the crew, once proud architects of the city's most daring criminal exploit, now found themselves facing the inevitabilities of justice and the often cold hand of fate. Their arrests were almost anticlimactic, no high-speed chase, no bloody standoffs, just a series of quiet, resigned moments in dim city apartments or sun-faded backyards where they had tried in vain to disappear into anonymity. For most, their final struggle wasn't with the law, but with the weight of decades spent always glancing over their shoulders. In courtroom after courtroom, the men listened without drama as prosecutors recounted their ingenious plan and the audacious execution that nearly changed the annals of New York crime. Age became both a shield and a curse. The media dubbed them the gentlemen outlaws, marveling at their cunning while the law made no exceptions for the gray at their temples. Sentences mounted quickly, a sum total surpassing 70 years behind bars, with little hope for mercy or early release given the international embarrassment and massive financial losses provoked by their crime. Yet, if the men's fates were sealed, the true devastation landed on another front. Safeguard Vaults itself. Once synonymous with invincibility and unshakable trust, the company fell swiftly after the heist. Its remaining clients, scandalized and terrified, yanked their valuables en masse. Decades-long reputations and fortunes vanished in the slipstream. Insurance could not possibly cover the breadth of what was lost. Heirlooms steeped in history, unique gems, and personal treasures whose like would never exist again. For Wall Street, the burglary was a shock that rippled far beyond financial circles. It shattered long-standing faith in technological security, proving that even the most sophisticated systems could be unraveled by experience, patience, and old-school collaboration. New regulations were swiftly put in place. Vault companies radically overhauled their policies, surveillance protocols, and internal vetting processes. Law enforcement agencies, stung by humiliation, embraced analytics, retroactive surveillance, and cross-border trace collaboration like never before. Perhaps the most lasting lesson, though, was psychological. The realization that threats are not always brash, high-tech, or youthful in ambition. Sometimes the adversary waiting to outsmart you is the one who's seen it all before, whose very ordinariness, patience, and hard-won wisdom allows them to find cracks in even the thickest armor. In the end, the final job squad left a mark not just through their theft, but through the imperative they created. The urgent call to see beyond surface assurances, to prepare for the unexpected, and to remember that vulnerability wears many faces, sometimes hidden behind a gentle smile or trembling hands. The city moved on, but its shadows grew deeper and a little more wary, forever shaped by the legend of those who almost got away with the impossible.